Hey, welcome everybody to episode 9. I am really excited about today's episode because it's going to be fun. It's going to be really interesting. I've always loved this particular material. I mean, I've always loved, generally speaking, hermeneutics, interpreting the Bible, principles of biblical interpretation. But specifically, I've always enjoyed studying this particular topic that I'm going to be covering today. But before we get into that, let me just review a couple of things, because next week, which will be episode 10, will be my final episode in this series. And before we get there, I want to kind of review a few things, but also point you to which episodes contain the specific principles that I've taught, okay? So first, let me just give you an outline of what we've covered so far in the 9 weeks, and then where you can find those specific principles if you want to go back to a previous episode and see where I kind of focus on that specific one. So, okay, number one principle is for biblical interpretation is this. There are 3 fundamental principles of biblical interpretation, and they are context, history, and genre. Okay. And as I've said before, probably almost every episode, this is what you got to memorize. This is the very minimum that you have to commit to memory, so that for the rest of your life, whenever you're going about reading this book and doing Bible study or doing any kind of interpretation or anything, any reflection on that, I want that to become so ingrained in your thinking that it's just a part of how you approach the text. And context, history, genre, remember, is, what is the context? What's the author talking about in the surrounding text? History, the question would be, what's the historical occasion for why the author is writing what they are writing or what they've written? And then genre, you want to ask the question, what's the literary style? Is this a parable? Is this an epistle? Is this narrative? Is this apocalyptic literature? Figure out what is the literary style that's being used, and then apply that literary style's interpretive principles to better understand what you're reading, okay? So that's number one, is knowing the 3 foundational or fundamental principles of biblical interpretation: context, history, genre. Now, we covered that in episode 1. We've also covered it in episode 7 and probably several other ones. So that one's kind of a little bit hard to say where I covered all 3 of them. But let me break them down a little bit more for you. So with regards to context, I definitely hit this in episode 1 and 2, and for the most part, probably all of them. On history, so episode 3 is where I talk specifically about asking the question about the history of a certain passage. And we looked at a passage in Revelation, which is where Jesus is speaking to the church in Laodicea. So if you wanted to focus a little bit more about where I talked about the role of history, that would be the one. When it comes to genre, I think the title of the episode was I Break for Genres, and it was episode 4. Okay. So, but that is the first principle of biblical interpretation, which is to know the 3 foundational principles: context, history, genre. Okay. So interpretive principle number 2 is know the difference between meaning and application. And always remember to first determine the meaning before you try to figure out the application. Okay. This was episode 2, right? A third interpretive principle is to ignore Bible chapters and verses when it comes to interpreting a passage, okay? And we covered this in episode 5. Interpretive principle number 4 is to know your Bible translation, okay? In other words, every Bible translation has a certain philosophy of how the Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic scholars interpreted translated the original language into English, or whatever language you're reading your Bible into. And each of these teams of scholars and translators had a different philosophy of translation, okay? It's not that one's better or worse, it's just that you got to know what they are doing with the original text, so that when you're reading something in English, you know what they've done with the original, okay? And that was episode 6, okay? And then last week, we talked about checking your worldview at the door, which means setting aside your 21st century Western worldview aside and putting on a biblical worldview, okay? And that was episode 8, okay? So that's kind of what we've covered over the last 8 weeks. And today we're doing episode 9. And what we're going to be looking at is the Nativity. And what I want to do is look at the traditional story of the Nativity and ask the question, is that traditional story, is it accurate? Is that what really happened? And we'll be doing that by asking the question, well, is it biblical, right? Is the traditional narrative that we've heard and that every Christmas when we put out our little decorative ornaments, or we set up a little stage of a nativity on a table or something like that. We have these little wooden figures. You got Mary, you got Joseph, you got little baby Jesus sitting in a manger. You got a donkey and maybe some cattle around. And of course it's all in a stable or maybe in a cave or something like that, right? And so I want to take a fresh look at this question. What really happened? What do we know from the Bible regarding the Nativity? And I believe as we do this, it'll cause us to rethink, perhaps correct some mistaken notions about what happened during the Nativity. Now, for those of you who might be nervous that I'm going to start saying some kind of heresy, I'm not. No fundamental, doctrine is in jeopardy here. I'm not going to be like, oh yeah, actually, Joseph and Mary weren't the parents of Jesus. It was somebody else. No. I'm just talking about some details that don't really affect our theology for the most part. Although I believe there is one element that will apply to us in a new and unique way once we understand a more, I believe, accurate depiction of what happened in the Nativity. Okay. Now, I just want to say though up front here that episode 9, today's episode, isn't going to be so much a how-to type of episode. In other words, in the previous 8 episodes, I've tried to give you principles that you can apply and either perhaps even memorize and apply to your own Bible study and reading. Okay. My goal isn't to do that today, although you certainly could apply these principles. But I'm not. My goal isn't to try to say, okay, here's something you should have figured out. Okay. Because I believe actually some of the mistakes that have been made in the understanding of the traditional nativity narrative have been made by the scholars themselves and by just sort of like this group think, this group way of thinking about certain stories. Okay. So I'm not really going to place the blame on anybody, although maybe there is some blame to be placed somewhere. I don't know where that is. That's not my goal here. Okay. But because of that, it's not that I think any individual person could have discovered the truth about the nativity narrative. Okay. So that's why I'm saying this isn't going to be so much of a how-to. All right. But it will demonstrate how ignoring many interpretive principles could eventually lead to a mistaken narrative, even about an important story, which we all think that we kind of know, okay? And so here is what I believe a recipe for interpretive disaster, okay? And I think this is what's happened with regards to the nativity, all right? Number 1, start with an improperly or incorrectly translated word, okay? So we're going to be looking at a specific Greek word. We'll come to that in just a moment. But part of this interpretive disaster begins with the fact that you begin with a poorly translated Greek word, okay? Second of all, ditch a biblical worldview. Or to put it another way, don't put on a biblical worldview. Rather, keep your 21st century Western American eyes, as you look at a biblical text, and do not jettison that and adopt a biblical text or a biblical worldview. Okay, that's another key ingredient for a recipe for disaster. All right. Number 3, favor tradition over scholarship, over biblical scholarship, right? Another thing, ignore historical culture. Ignore what it was like to live in first century Palestine. Ignore what it was like to be a peasant living in the first century in this particular region, okay? Ignore archaeology. Ignore all the evidence and data that we have from archaeological research that's been done for hundreds of years in this region. And then, of course, you have to mix in some 21st century Western individualism to the mix and put it in the oven, and out comes the nativity story that we all have come to believe and have literally created, trinkets and decorative items and little wooden figures to create the scene, which I'm going to argue isn't exactly biblical, okay? So just be warned, if you watch this episode, it might cause you to spend another $50 this coming Christmas to decorate your house biblically. Okay, no, just for the record, I still have my old nativity scene that I still put out for Christmas. Only because I haven't found an accurate one, but all right, we'll get to that in a moment. All right, so let me first tell you what is the traditional nativity narrative, okay? Here's how it's typically understood, give or take a few details, all right? Joseph and Mary leave Nazareth and head to Bethlehem because there's a census, okay? And they do this while Mary is pregnant. And in fact, if you've seen, movies or other depictions of this, Mary typically has a very significant baby bump. Like, she is visibly pregnant. She's, sitting on top of a donkey, pregnant and hot and uncomfortable. And the donkey's just like going like this. And they're going from Nazareth to Bethlehem. It's a long journey, okay? On their way there, as they begin to arrive towards Bethlehem, Mary goes into labor, okay? And so Mary and Joseph are like, man, we got to find a place to give birth to our kid, right? So they run to the Hiltons, the motels, the inns, and they're all booked, because there's a convention or something like that going on there in Bethlehem that day. And so they're like, okay, there's no room in any of the hotels. So they go to a cave or to a stable, and, in a rushed fashion, they give birth to Jesus. They're all alone. They don't know what to do with him. So they put him in a manger. And then eventually, after the dust settles, they kind of just, look at Jesus and kind of awe and coo and, reflect upon the beauty of this night, But Joseph and Mary basically have Jesus, they give birth to Jesus alone in a stable or in a cave or somewhere by themselves because there is no room in any of the inns or hotels in Bethlehem, okay? Now, as I said, this makes for a cute decorative Christmas set for you to put on your tables and out. But I want to offer you 4 arguments that will cause you to rethink the traditional nativity narrative, okay? So it's really 4 lines of evidence or 4 pieces of evidence from 4 different areas, okay? So first, we're going to talk about what I call the cultural argument, right? So argument number 1 is the cultural argument. And what I'm asking you to do here is to do what we talked about in episode 8, which is check your worldview at the door. Meaning, get rid of your 21st century Western American, Canadian, European, whatever it is, worldview. Just ditch that, okay? Because it really has no place in understanding the world of the first century, all right? So, a couple things going on here with regards to number 1, the cultural argument. Let's first talk about the nature of visiting out-of-town family, okay? Or even friends for that matter. All right. If you're a 21st century Westerner and you travel across the country to visit some family or friends, close friends, it's quite possible that you might end up staying at a hotel or an inn of some sort, okay, some other residence, because you don't want to inconvenience your family or your friends. Or maybe there isn't enough room or whatever might be the case, okay? That's what a 21st century Westerner would do, okay? That's not what a first century Jew or someone living in first century Palestine would do, all right? They would never travel to visit family and stay at a hotel. That would be just unthinkable, okay? Family would be obligated to host you at their home. And if they didn't have space, they would make space, right? And so we got to understand that it would be unthinkable that Joseph would travel back to his the town in which he grew up in or that he was from, his ancestral origin, and end up staying at a hotel or an inn. His family would immediately welcome him in. And even if they, didn't recognize him or it's been a long time since he's been there, all you'd have to do is just simply, make note of his ancestors and who he was and the line of David and so on and so forth. And they'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, you're that Joseph. Yeah, of course, come on in, right? So to suggest that they would stay at a hotel this is Western thinking, okay? Now, granted, I've grown up mostly in the United States, but my family is Middle Eastern. They all came from Iraq. All of my families, with the exception of myself, was born in Baghdad. And so I still grew up in a Middle Eastern kind of mindset because my parents, my brother and all my relatives are, for the most part, Iraqi and, Middle Eastern thinking. And so because we are Assyrians ethnically, and Assyrians come from a very collectivistic culture. And it is certainly the case, and as you know, I travel a lot around the country and the world, and whenever I'm in an area that's nearby family, they will insist that I leave whatever hotel I'm at or wherever guest home I'm at and come and stay with them. Like, it's dishonorable if I stayed at a hotel. Like, it was just unthinkable, okay? So it's never an option for me to be anywhere within striking distance of my relatives and not stay at their house, okay? Because again, that's just Middle Eastern and first century Palestine thinking. Right? So that's one thing about the cultural argument. The second thing about the cultural argument I'd add is that it is on the nature of where you keep farm animals. Now, again, if you're a 21st century Westerner and you have farm animals like cattle and whatever, where do you keep them? Outside, in a barn, in a stable, out in a field, because typically we are wealthy, right? We have land, we can build structures, and we keep our animals, far away from us, away from the family. First century Palestine, if you're a peasant, not so much the case, right? You don't have the luxury to afford that. And we'll talk some more in a minute or in a few minutes about where they might keep their animals, all right? But this is just, again, it's different what we would do today versus what they would do back then, okay? And then the third thing I'd add about the cultural argument, or this first line of reasoning with regards to understanding the culture, is that is on the nature of birth events, okay? So if you're a Westerner, like myself, right, and your spouse is giving birth, or you are giving birth to a child, this is for the most part a private event, right? I mean, when my wife, we have two kids. When we had both of our kids, it was a private event. I mean, yeah, the doctor was there, and we had a doula, okay, but we didn't have any, family. We didn't have any relatives like hanging out, checking out, how things are going. They waited somewhere else, okay, because birth events are a private affair. Okay, that's not the case though when it comes to first century Palestine. Okay, birth is a family affair, not a private affair, right? So this is our first line of argument, is the cultural argument, all right? Rethinking the difference between 21st century Westerners and first century Jews or first century residents of Palestine, and how they think about the nature of visiting out-of-town family, where you keep animals, and the nature of birth events, okay? So that's our first line of thinking, first line of evidence. Let's now consider a second line of evidence, or a place where we're going to create another argument. And that would be the historical argument. And with regards to this, I want to ask the question, why were Joseph and Mary headed to Bethlehem? Well, as probably most of you know, is because there was a census taking place, right? And so everyone was required to go back to their town of origin to be counted for the census. And so as a result, not only was Joseph and Mary headed to Bethlehem, but so was everyone else who was from Bethlehem was headed back to Bethlehem. Okay. So probably many relatives of Joseph were also headed back to Bethlehem. As you'll see, this will play a role in our new understanding of the Nativity, right? Now, just so you know, by the way, the journey from Nazareth, which I was there 2 years ago, to Bethlehem, which I was also there a couple of years ago. In fact, even last year, or no, was it last year? No, this year. Yeah, last year. Sorry, this year was coronavirus. So I did go to Israel, but I turned around and flew back right away. That was a disaster. Anyways, tangent. But the journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem is about, 80 miles or so. But you got to remember, Samaria is right in the middle. And any, God-fearing Jew, or not God-fearing Jew, but any Jew is not going to go through Samaria because the Samaritans were hated people. The Samaritans were half Jewish and half Assyrian, half me, right? And because of that, they were half-breeds, and everybody hated the Samaritans. And so Joseph would have had to go around Samaria in order to get down to Bethlehem. So it was more than 80 miles. I don't know. It's probably 3-4 days journey. It's hard to imagine that Joseph would make that journey while Mary was 8 months pregnant, with this huge baby bump. This is just historically weird. It doesn't seem like this is something that Joseph would do. Like, was he so foolish as to put Mary on a donkey for a 3 to 4 day journey while she's, 8 months pregnant, 7 months pregnant, or, whatever pregnant she was? It just doesn't make any sense. Okay. Now, furthermore, with regards to history, Bethlehem at the time was not a major city, and it was not on a major road. And consequently, it almost certainly didn't have any hotels or inns. Okay. So this is looking to cast a lot of questions about these inns that were allegedly, filled up, and consequently, sending Mary and Joseph off to some remote location in a stable or something like that. Okay. So that's the second line of argument, the historical argument. So the first argument is a cultural argument. The second argument is a historical argument. The third argument I want to offer is a lexical or a literary argument. All right. Now let's look and see, what does Luke chapter 2, verse 7 say about the narrative story. Okay. So this is NASB. It says, she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Right? So there wasn't any room for them in the inn. ESV says she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling cloths, laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. The 1984 NIV translation also says there was no room for them in the inn. Okay, so all of these translations that have been dominant for so many years say that there was no room for them in the inn. Okay, and so we naturally think inn. There's no room for them in the hotels because they were booked for whatever reason. Okay, but we know from the historical argument that Bethlehem probably didn't have any inns, didn't have any hotels. It wasn't a major city on a major road. Okay, so let's consider, well, what is this word inn? What's the Greek word for inn? Well, the Greek word that is translated as inn is kataluma. And for those of you who know Greek, forgive my pronunciations, okay? Kataluma, all right, is the Greek word. Now, Greek scholars have pointed out that the word kataluma doesn't really mean inn as in hotel, right? In fact, if Luke, the gospel writer here, really wanted to say there was no room in a hotel, there was no room in an inn, he already had a perfectly good word that meant inn or hotel. And this is the word, again, I'm going to probably mispronounce it, pandochian, or Pandocheon, I don't know, Pandocheon, doesn't matter. But it's from Luke 10:34, where Luke tells a story, Luke quotes Jesus telling the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? And if you remember in the parable of the Good Samaritan, a man is beaten up, left for dead. The priest and Levite walk by, they see him, they ignore him. The Samaritan sees him, has compassion on him, puts, helps to heal him, and then takes him on his beast, his animal, and walks him over to a hotel and puts him up in a hotel, puts him in an inn, right? And this is the actual words. It says, the Good Samaritan came to him, bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them, put him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn and took care of him. Now, in that case, the word inn is the Greek word pandocheon, okay? Pandocheon. And that word, does mean like a hotel where travelers who are totally, have no relationships would stay in, okay? So if Luke really wanted to say that Joseph and Mary didn't find any room in a hotel, he could have used that word. After all, he used that word earlier in his gospel, later in his gospel, okay? But he didn't. He chose a different word, kataluma. Now, what does kataluma mean? Well, it literally means upper room or guest room. In fact, it's the same word that is used when Jesus is said to have his Last Supper in the upper room. It's the kataluma, the upper room. And it's typically a separate room in a house that is either in the back or above where visitors might stay in, okay? Or in the case of the Lord's Supper, where Jesus and his disciples stayed, okay? So this is our third line of reasoning, the literary argument. The word that Luke uses, kataluma, doesn't mean inn or hotel. It means upper room or guest room. And now let's turn to our fourth and last piece of evidence. And this is what I call the archaeological argument, all right? What do we know from the archaeological digs and basically what we know about archaeology today with regards to first century homes in Palestine that were owned by peasants? What did they look like? Well, now it's time for show and tell. So I'm going to share with you an image here that I got that depicts a first century home of a peasant, okay? Notice something about this house. First of all, on the ground floor, there's a couple of compartments. You have a main living area, okay? But then towards the front or near the outside of the home, there's another compartment, which is where they typically would bring in animals inside at night, or maybe even during the winter months, because animals generate heat, and heat is nice when things are cold. But they would bring in animals at night or in the winter into this inside compartment in the main sort of area of their homes. And notice also that there are some feeding troughs inside the house, mangers, where they would put food for these animals to be able to eat at night or during the winter months, okay? Now, not all homes, of course, look like this, but in this case, so remember I said that the word kataluma, guest room, could be in some cases a room behind the main sort of living quarters where guests might stay. In this particular image we have, it shows the kataluma on the second story, on the upstairs, okay? And so that upstairs room is the upper room that Jesus would have had his Last Supper with his disciples. And it's also what is referred to in the Nativity story when Luke says there was no room in the kataluma, in the upper room, in the guest room, all right? Now, think about this. Let's put this all together, all these four pieces of evidence, okay? What was the problem? Well, first of all, keep in mind, we have no evidence to think that Joseph brought Mary when she was 8 months pregnant or 7 months pregnant or showing this big old baby bump. That's just, Hollywood storytelling or whoever made these stories up, right? I've seen it in some Hollywood movies, but So first of all, just forget that. Probably Joseph and Mary arrived very early on in her pregnancy, perhaps, okay? And then eventually the time came for her to give birth, okay? But here was the problem. The problem wasn't that they couldn't find a hotel room, because there's no way they would have even stayed in a hotel. First of all, there were no hotels in Bethlehem. And second of all, there's no way they would make their relatives, family relatives, stay in a hotel, okay? The problem was that everybody who were relatives of Joseph had come in from out of town for the census, and most likely earlier visitors came, stayed in the kataluma, in the upper room, and so therefore there was no room available in the upper kataluma, in the upper room, all right? Because some other relatives were staying there. And so since there was no room upstairs in the guest room, they probably Joseph and Mary stayed downstairs in the main living quarters, gave birth to Jesus there, while everyone was around, tons of family, and they placed Jesus in one of these feeding troughs, which was probably soft, filled with straw or hay or whatever. Okay? In other words, Jesus most likely, I can't say I can prove this, Jesus most likely was born in a house with tons of people around, all of his loving family all around, and placed in a manger inside the home. And yeah, there were animals there, of course, because there were animals brought inside the home at night or in the winter months to stay warm or to provide heat. And of course, they would have eaten from the feeding troughs, the mangers that were there as well. All right. By the way, keep in mind, Matthew's account says that the Magi, when they came, it says they came to a house, right? Why did they come to a house? Because that's where Joseph and Mary were. They were staying at a house, right? Probably one of the relatives' homes, right? Now, I know this rethinking of the nativity narrative probably doesn't make the nativity story as cute or quaint, right? But at least now we have a more biblical picture of probably what it was like, okay? Jesus wasn't born all alone, outcast, in the hills with Joseph and Mary by themselves because they couldn't find a hotel room. No, he was born in a house with all his family all around. Yes, probably watching, I don't know. But they were probably all around in big celebration that, Mary had now a child, right? And I was kind of thinking about, well, what's the big problem with this? Besides it not being biblical or true, what's the big problem with this Jesus being born alone in a stable sort of narrative? And I think this is maybe where some of the application comes in. It feels to me like it somehow or somewhat or to some degree undermines the incarnation. Because if you think about it, or at least the implications of the incarnation, right? If Jesus is born in a stable, outcast and alone with Joseph and Mary, well, it kind of makes him seem like he enters into humanity in a very distant way, no different than, say, if a king was born, born in a palace somewhere all alone, isolated from the everyday person, right? But the message of the incarnation is actually quite the opposite, that Jesus is one of us. He came to dwell among us, And certainly, yes, he was born in a first century Jewish home with all his loving family all around. Yes, he's a king, but he is even amongst, he's even among the poor when he's born, amongst the peasants, And that's because Jesus really is a person, a king who dwells among us and who's for all of us. He's for all people, all classes, all occupations. He's among us. And I think when we see Jesus as this sort of cast out, baby who's born all alone without anybody, it sort of just gives a different feeling for what the incarnation really is supposed to be like. And that is that Jesus does dwell among us. He's born among us. He's born with his family. He's born with people who all are near him and love him. Okay. So, I guess I can move away from that picture now. Anyways, hope you like that picture. I love that picture. I remember having to get that. I had to order that picture from a friend of mine who had a version of it. I think it was a transparency originally, but we got to put it onto a transparency for those of you who went to school many, many years ago, you probably know those things are. But it was a transparency I got eventually put on a piece of paper, and then I scanned it so I could have it for you guys to see here. So pretty cool. But anyways, if anybody has or knows of a nativity decorative set that is biblically accurate, man, let me know. I'd love to find one. I would come and buy it. So anyways, hey, I'm going to end here. I want to give you, though, a heads up about next week, which will be my final week teaching this. It'll be episode 10. And what I'm going to be doing is going over my favorite Bible study tools or helps, if you will. Okay. So basically, it's all the tools that I use when I'm trying to study a passage and try to make sense of it. Sometimes my wife and I will come over here and go to this library that we have, and we'll, in my house, and we'll just, go through some resources that I believe will help us to make sense of what we're reading, And so I'm going to try to unpack some of those for you. All right. Okay. I'm going to sign off here. I'll take a look at some of your questions that you guys have posted in the chat. And hopefully I'll try to get back to most of you there. All right. Thanks for joining me today. I will see you next week for episode 10, which will be Alan's favorite Bible helps. See you then.